it's good.
Oh, awesome. Well, we'll get it kicked off if you like. So,
Yeah.
first of all, would you like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Alyssa Azar. I'm 23 years old, based in Brisbane. But I guess the most prominent part of my story is I'm a mountain climber, specifically high altitude mountaineering. So in 2016, I became the youngest Australian to summit Mount Everest. I've since climbed Everest for a second time. So I've climbed both the south and north sides of the mountain. But yeah, really spent the last sort of 10 years climbing on mountains around the world, from Russia to Nepal to South America. And that's kind of what we do as well. So I co-own an adventure company that does treks like the Kokoda track and things like that. Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So, you've obviously been to adventure and that sort of thing since you were pretty young, especially with your dad. So, what are your first memories around adventure? Because you did Kokoda when you were about 8 years old or something, didn't you?
Yes, that's right. So my first real sort of international big adventure was the Kokoda track, and that was in 2005 when I was 8. And yeah, my really earliest memories of adventure, I would say, even started when I was about 6. So I was very hyperactive when I was very early days in school. Loved all sorts of different sports. And it just so happened that my dad was a guide on the Kokoda track. And so I was kind of just around it. I heard about it a lot. I met a lot of the clients that he was training to take across Kokoda. So they'd all do, a 12-week training program. And a large part of that was on the weekends, they do a lot of bushwalking. And I remember just kind of getting into that really with no intention initially of doing Kokoda, and but just took to it straight away, loved it. So most of my weekends from the age of 6 on were spent out bushwalking with a pack on, and I would tag along for their Kokoda training, and did that for about a year. And throughout that year, that's sort of when the idea of Kokoda started to pop into my head, and I was like, oh, maybe it's something that I could do someday. And pretty much started harassing my dad about it, about, when can I go? And I've been training, and uh, initially it was not now, you'll need to wait a few years. But it was interesting because he came back from a trip when I was about 7. So we'd just done another Kokoda, and he actually said to me, all right, if you really want to go, I'll give you the opportunity, but you're going to have to train consistently for a year, another year on top of what you're already doing. I'm going to set that training plan so you'll train 3 times a week, including your pack walks. If you do all that, then you can go to Kokoda. And so, yeah, that set me up really well to succeed at adventures, knowing that yeah, it's not just the trip itself, it's all the preparation as well. But that was, yeah, really my introduction into the world of adventure.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible story. So, what was it about adventure that appealed to you so much at that time?
I think it was a mix of things. I did like the adventurous side to it. I think I saw how passionate my dad was about it, and that kind of interested me. I mean, I was around a lot of people who were quite successful in their own right, but no one who was that into what they were doing like he was. And I guess I wanted something like that in my life, but also I think it was more the both the physical and mental process that you go through. I really enjoyed not just setting that goal, but even, being out there and training just locally. You'd come back each time with sort of a new respect for what you can do physically and mentally. And so for me, it was kind of always digging to find how far I could go and push that limit. I think that's probably what's kept me in it as long as I have.
Yeah, okay. And then fast forwarding a few years, what sort of inspired you to first want to climb Mount Everest?
So Everest came up really when I was about 14. So it's something that had been in the back of my mind really pretty much since Kokoda. I don't know exactly where that came from. It's something that I'd read about in a book at school. And like a lot of climbers, the idea of it kind of intrigues you. And I think it was a mix of things. So it was definitely when I was training for Kokoda and doing a lot of weekend hikes and that. I remember we used to, I grew up in Toowoomba. We used to go down to Brisbane and go into the mountain design stores, and all along the walls they had any of Australia's elite mountaineers and all the mountains they'd climbed. And obviously Everest was on there and all these expeditions that had been supported. And yeah, that to me was like the top of this industry that I was trying to get into, something to kind of aspire to one day. And so I think it was kind of a couple of little things that happened. But when I actually decided to go for it, I had just climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. So that for me was when I realized that as much as I loved adventure in general, the mountains specifically were always the most important thing to me. I loved it. I loved trekking to Nepal and Everest Base Camp. But yeah, once I did Kilimanjaro, I was like, certainly pushing that physical and mental limit at altitude is another level. And so that interested me as well. It was kind of all of those things that came together and made me go, this is the path I want to go down. And yeah, then pretty much got back from Kilimanjaro and set about making that happen.
So you'd had a fair bit of experience before you sort of first wanted to do that first climb?
Yeah, absolutely. But in having said that, it was certainly a pretty intensive training process because I'd done a lot of trekking. You know, at that point, when I decided to climb Everest, I'd crossed the Kokoda track, I'd done Everest Base Camp and Mount Kilimanjaro, as well as the Aussie 10 peaks, so the 10 highest peaks here in Australia. But, you know, Everest and that sort of altitude, you know, was a whole nother level yet again. So I knew that I was in for a few years of training. There were a lot of skills that I didn't have. I needed to go and learn. And even just the gear, everything's a lot more technical than it is when you're just sort of hiking. So, yeah, I started with a climbing course in New Zealand, went over and did 10 days to we ended up learning probably more skill than you need, but it's good to have and know you have those skills. So we did everything from ice climbing to pulling people out of crevasses if they'd fallen in to, yeah, just any of the sort of survival and mountaineering skills. And then I could really take those skills and know that I've got them on all of the training climbs. But yeah, before my first attempt on Everest, I'd say that was about a 3-year process of physically training every day. So being on a training program to make sure, because I had a lot of work to do in, you know, the physical side of things still. I knew that, you know, Everest summit day is sometimes 20 to 24 hours straight of climbing, and you're doing that at high altitude. So at no point in that process, despite my experience, did I feel like I had it. I knew I had to keep striving for that next level if I was going to be ready for it. And yeah, that went on for about 3 years before my first attempt.
Yeah, right. And then was it your first two attempts that actually got called off as well?
Yes, yeah. So my first attempt on Everest was in 2014. So the Everest climbing season is always April and May. So I flew over there. I was only 17 at the time and flew over in early April to Kathmandu in Nepal. And then we did the trek into Everest Base Camp. And base camp's your home away from home. You set up there for the next 2 months. And that's always the point that you come back to between climbs and where we store everything. And so we got into base camp. We had a team of about 10 climbers, all internationals. There's some from South Africa, some from Nepal, the UK, different places. And yeah, we'd only been there for, I'd say, about a week. And there was an avalanche in the very first section of the mountain that killed 16 climbers. And so that was within the first week of the climbing season. It was also the biggest accident, the biggest single accident that's ever
Wow.
happened on Everest. So that was my introduction to Everest, and certainly was a reminder of what can go wrong on the mountain and why we prepare and get ready with a pretty solid training schedule, because you're preparing for the worst case scenario. You want to be able to handle yourself in that situation. And unfortunately, in a situation like that, it was literally a split second and that happened, and there isn't anything you can really do other than offer whatever support you can. But yeah, so that was it for that climbing season. And that was certainly challenging to move forward from. I remember sort of taking a few months, and it was only when sort of the Sherpas were positive about Everest again and talking about another climbing season that I decided I would have a second attempt. So I went back in 2015. Again, similar process. So early April, you fly into Kathmandu and then do the trek into base camp with the same climbing team. And on my second attempt, we'd been there for a couple of weeks. So we hadn't really climbed on Everest yet. We'd just done some local hikes to acclimatize, because it takes a while for your body to adapt at base camp alone. you're breathing about 50% less oxygen than you are at sea level, because we're already above 5,000 meters. So you're already starting to feel that altitude. Your body has to work pretty hard to adapt to it. So yeah, I remember in 2015, there was the day that we were meant to start climbing. I've just got to sign something.
Yeah, it's all good.
So 2015, the day that we were meant to start climbing on the mountain, I actually remember we always start really early in the morning. So it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. We're setting out for the first climb, and we're going up through one of the most notorious sections on the mountain called the Khumbu Icefall, where that accident happened the year prior. And I remember one of the head Sherpas saying to our team, we're going to delay it one more day because there'd been a lot of snowfall in that part of the mountain and it makes it more unstable than usual. So we'll have a rest day in base camp and we'll go up tomorrow. And so we did that. And it was around midday that day that the Nepal earthquake hit. And so I remember being in, we just finished lunch as a team because you've got a mess tent in base camp and then everyone's got their own personal tent as well. And so we just finished lunch and I remember being back in my personal tent just reading or something and feeling the ground shake, and it didn't fully process what it was at first. It's just a really bizarre feeling. And also when you're in Everest base camp, that's usually the safest place on the mountain. Once you start climbing is when you expect that things could happen. But you've kind of got your guard down in base camp a lot of the time because it's the rest point. And so, yeah, I just remember feeling that. And then hearing this noise outside my tent, and it was just like a massive rushing noise. And so I unzipped it and I looked out my tent and I could just see this wall of snow coming at us. And it was the biggest avalanche I've ever seen because that earthquake had triggered all of the mountains around us, which is surrounded by in base camp, to form almost one big avalanche that tore through base camp. We were very fortunate just with the positioning of our camp that we did get hit, but it was a little bit further outside the center and what weren't directly hit. But yeah, I remember from the time I saw that avalanche coming to the time it hit, there was probably like 3 seconds to react. So straight away, I zipped up my tent, jumped to the other side of it, and did what I was taught on that New Zealand climbing course years earlier. They teach you to create an air pocket with your arms so that you can just have a little bit of room to breathe, so that if you are buried under an avalanche, it just buys you a little bit of time. So hopefully someone can come and dig you out. But yeah, it was straight into reaction mode. And then I was fortunate that I was mostly buried, but able to get out of my tent. And then straight away it was like, all right, we've got to look for other team members. We got to make sure no one else is buried. And it just went from a climbing expedition to a rescue operation straight away. And yeah, just the whole country was so unstable. So we got stuck over there for a couple of weeks. We weren't sure how long we were going to be stuck over there. So we were very fortunate that it was only a couple of weeks and we were able to get home. But yeah, you know, the airport wasn't closed. And also we couldn't go back to base camp because of all the aftershocks, and that was going to trigger more avalanches. So again, we were just over there offering any sort of help that we could to any climbers or locals. And after a few weeks of being over there, it was time to head home. So that was my second experience on Everest. And very, very full on.
Yeah, so how did you cope with that mentally? Because obviously that's a lot of training and money and all sorts of things put into that. And then 2 years in a row to have it taken from you. I can't imagine that was an easy experience.
Yeah, you're really dealing with the two sides of it as well, because certainly, you know, like I remember my first trip to Nepal, I was 10. And so it's always been a place that's been really special to me. And then to see what happened to the country. But then you're right, you're dealing with this other side that's like a bit selfish, but as an athlete, you go, I've put years into this. So I've sacrificed a lot of personal stuff to revolve my life around this. And it just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So at that point, I'd put 4 years of preparation and training into that one climb. And it just seemed like it was not going to happen. So it was really mentally challenging to get over that. And I think that was the biggest hurdle. So I returned home, and again, after a couple of months, started sort of tossing with the idea of, would I go back? Will that be next year? Will it be in a few years? Do I take a step away from it? I knew I still had the desire to climb Everest deep down. I wasn't deterred by the risks, but yeah, it was now a question of, will it happen because of outside circumstances? So once it sort of started to become clear that it could open up, and even really before then, I started getting back into training. And that was really important for me because I knew if I am going to return to the mountain, you've got to be physically ready. But now the biggest hurdle was mental. I didn't want to go over there giving 50% because, oh, it might not happen. I knew if I'm going to be in the best position possible, I've got to be at 100%. And a large part of my motivation in returning for a third attempt, and certainly how I was able to train for another year, was, I think, one, you do sort of reflect on all the work you've put in up to that point, and that sort of helps you. But also, I went into it choosing to allow it to make me a better climber. So for me, it was like, okay, whilst it obviously wasn't ideal, those 2 climbing seasons taught me that I'm actually far more capable than a lot of people thought. You know, they were worried that I was too young, but I handled those situations exactly how I'd hoped I would. I reacted really quickly. We weren't emotional about it. We did all the things the way it should have been done. So that told me that I deserved to be on the mountain. I did have the skills. But also, you know, training for that third attempt, I wanted to be so good that even if there was the tiniest window, I'd be ready to go. So typically when you're on Everest, after you've acclimatized, you spend about 8 weeks up there acclimatizing. You then go for a week-long summit push. But, you know, it's very weather dependent. So sometimes that might shut and you might get 3 days instead of 5. You might get 2 days instead of 5 where you might be able to hit the summit. For me, it was about being that good of a climber that if there was any chance we were going to be able to summit and climb on the mountain, I'd be strong and fit and ready to go. So that was really my motivation in returning for a third attempt, but definitely getting over that mental side of things was far harder than the physical.
Yeah, for sure. So you're obviously the youngest Australian to have ever climbed Everest as well. Is that something you ever look back on and just think about how truly special it actually is?
Yeah, definitely. I think more so since I've done it. Funnily enough, I didn't realize when I'd set the goal of Everest that would potentially be there. I kind of thought, oh, someone must have done it younger by now. I knew of Rex Pemberton, who was previously the youngest Australian when he was 21. But yeah, I didn't really know that. And I think it's something that definitely made that climb pretty special. But it's something I thought about actually on the way down. So I'd summited, I was on the way back down the mountain. And it was kind of a moment of disbelief where I had to sort of remind myself like, oh yeah, you're the youngest Australian to ever do this. Yeah, it definitely is special. And it's something I look back on now pretty fondly.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then did you have any sort of people saying before all your climbs that you shouldn't do it, or people that didn't believe you could do it?
Absolutely. I had both. So I had a lot of people, particularly after those 2 seasons as well. But yeah, I'd say all throughout, even before Kokoda, I'd say throughout anything I've ever done, there have been people who told me I wouldn't be capable of it. And pretty much with every single sort of trek or climb, that was pretty standard. So you sort of get good at sort of processing that. And I think probably a moment that stands out for me was when I was on my first trip to Kokoda. And my dad and we'd flown over to Port Moresby and we were about to start the trek on Kokoda the next day. And I actually remember that we kind of had our own small team, but we were part of a bigger team as well of Australian trekkers. And we just finished a team dinner in the hotel and we were all heading up to our rooms to get organised for the next day. And this guy who was a bit older and sort of came along, and I was standing right there, but completely ignored me and said to my dad, "Oh, you're kidding if you think she's going to make it. This is the day before setting foot onto Kokoda." And he was a bit more rude than that, but that was the gist. He just looked at him and said, "You're kidding if you think she's going to make it across the track." And it's interesting because I guess I was raised in a house where that wasn't even really a factor other than the work that you put in. You know, if you did the work, then you have every right to be there. If you can actually perform, then you have every right to be there. So that was something that was really drilled into me. And I had a lot of confidence because I'd done really more than a year of training. So I'd done a lot more than I guess the average trekker does because of my age. And so, yeah, I remember though we got up to the hotel room and I said to my dad at the time, I'm like, why doesn't anyone think I can do this? And he did a really good job at sort of explaining it to me. He didn't just say, I'll forget about it. Or he said, look, he's probably nervous himself. This is a serious undertaking for anyone. It's not easy for anyone. He probably doesn't want to believe that an 8-year-old girl can do it. It probably is intimidating to him, to cross the track. And so it's probably just nerves and all that sort of thing, because everyone is going to get pushed outside their comfort zone on this. And he's, taking it out on you. And that really helped me moving forward on a lot of trips to understand that when people make those comments, it's not actually a true reflection of what you're capable of. And you shouldn't let that stop you. If I had listened to what people told me I couldn't do, I literally wouldn't have had any of my most proud moments. I wouldn't have any idea of what I'm actually capable of. So I'm really glad that I, sort of ignored that and pushed past it. But yeah, that was certainly the case with Everest, I'm sure. When I set that goal, even though I'd done a lot of trekking, a lot of sort of similar scenarios to that one, even teachers in school that were like, okay, yeah, you're going to climb Everest, sure you are. So I had a lot of that throughout the way. I think it's pretty standard when you set really big goals for yourself, and you just sort of got to process it and move forward anyway.
That's fair enough too. Did you ever experience any sort of bad altitude sickness while you were on the mountains?
Yeah, I have had it before, not on Everest specifically, but on another climb. I've definitely had, I would say, early onset of cerebral edema, which is fluid in the brain. And that's the most dangerous one, because once you lose your cognitive ability, you're in a really dangerous situation. So yeah, I've had that on a mountain previously, and I was just fortunate that I had a really good team around me. It's really interesting, altitude. You just don't know what triggers that sometimes. And it's really dependent on the person, but also just, there's climbers who have successfully climbed Everest who do get altitude sickness elsewhere. So it's hard to say why it happens, but on Everest, particularly in 2016, I felt really, really strong. I think I went into that climb fitter than I'd ever been. And we also just had really good acclimatization. So we were really smart with our schedule for going up and down the mountain and making sure that we were fully acclimatized before we went for a summit push. And I could feel myself getting stronger and adapting each time we went up the mountain. So look, you definitely feel it. You get massive headaches. That's a normal part of it. So really from sort of Camp 2, which is 6,500 meters in altitude and above, but particularly once you get to Camp 3 at 7,000, you really start to feel it then. It's pretty normal to feel like your head's in a vice because of the pressure that you're feeling at that altitude. It becomes a mental game once you get to those last couple of days, because I find too that physically everything's sort of stripped away. I lost 10 kilos of muscle throughout the expedition. That's pretty standard. So like you're just burning, most days you're burning 10,000 calories a day, some a day probably 20,000, and you don't feel like eating. So it's really hard to force yourself to eat as well. And so you're just not getting the energy in that you need. And it's you look back on it and think, how does your body get through that? And it's totally a mental game. And you're typically not sleeping that well either. Everything's affected by the altitude, and even just getting your gear on, takes way longer because you're moving very slowly. You don't feel like you are, but you definitely are. Everything takes much longer. So yeah, I've had bits of altitude sickness here and there, but was very fortunate that for both my summits of Everest, particularly on summit day, I felt really strong.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So you've done the north and south faces. Which one's been your favorite to climb?
It's hard to say, but I would probably say the south side. I think for a few reasons. First of all, certainly my connection to Nepal. I trekked the Everest Base Camp Trail when I was 10, and so like that felt very familiar to me. I liked being in that region. But even just the climb itself, it's got so many iconic points. The Khumbu Icefall, the Lhotse Face, the balcony, like I'd read and heard about all those points. So that for me was a no-brainer. I wanted to go to that one first. And climb there. And if I'd never done a second summit, I just wanted to do the south side in particular. So that was my favorite. But yeah, the north side's got a lot of pretty amazing history as well. And I hadn't necessarily planned to climb there years earlier. And so when I got the opportunity, that was pretty exciting for me. But yeah, definitely the south side in Nepal.
Yeah, nice. And then, so you've literally been on top of the world, right? So the pinnacle of
Yeah.
climbing and that sort of thing. How do you stay motivated and keep the fire burning to keep going on more expeditions?
I think it really depends. So there's times where I have been really motivated, but I'll be honest, it was a struggle to find motivation and find a purpose initially after Everest. Like a lot of athletes, when that big thing you've been working toward for so long is now gone, it is quite challenging to find things that sort of fill that. I think what I've learned in the last few years is, first of all, not to compare everything that I do to that because it is such a unique experience as well. It's not just big, but it's quite unique. And there's few things that are as intense as that was. But for me, it's really just about listening to my own intuition and instinct. There are times where, yeah, I want to have that huge goal in front of me, and that takes everything I've got. And I'll certainly have those expeditions in the future. But then there's times where you just want a bit of balance and other things. And so I listen to that and go, okay, it's not the time for that, or it is. I think, yeah, it's just really dependent on whether my motivation is genuine. And I can sort of tell that through my action. So if I set a goal, but I'm missing training sessions, or I'm not putting the work in each day, I know that's not like me. I know that even as a 7-year-old training for Kokoda, if I really wanted something, I was going to get up every day and work hard toward it. So yeah, initially I think after Everest, I set a goal, and then just started to realize I'm not into it because I am not doing the work that I know I should be doing. And so that to me was a sign that, okay, maybe this isn't for you right now. And just being honest with myself about that. So yeah, I think it's interesting to try and find purpose after something that big. But yeah, it's definitely just listening to your own voice.
Yeah, okay. And after achieving such a high of Everest, did you ever experience a low after that? Because I know I've heard lots of athletes talk about that after winning events and things like that. Was there a low for you after you climbed it?
Absolutely. And I'd say it took far longer to sort of adjust than I thought. I think also because of how young I was. I mean, I started training really like a professional athlete full time for that goal when I was 14. And when I came out the other side, I was really 19, but 21 by the time I'd summited Everest for the second time. And so the biggest thing for me was trying to find an identity outside of it. That was a really big challenge because I didn't know who I was without this thing. Um, and so, yeah, just trying to, I guess, branch out and find other things that you like, get to know yourself in other areas. But yeah, I definitely had a pretty low point after Everest. Again, you just start to sort of feel like there's no purpose, there's no point. You had this thing that was driving you. And I think I'd tried a lot of different things that just didn't feel the same. And that was my biggest challenge in moving on from it. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. And what's been your sort of your biggest fear in all the mountain climbing that you've done? Because obviously it's a pretty high risk sport. So yeah,
Yeah.
what's been sort of like your most fearful point?
So I've had, I would say, there's probably four that stand out big time to me. The first one is being in that earthquake and that avalanche. There was, yeah, probably like within a sort of 30-second period when that avalanche initially hit, where I said to myself, and I knew like I'm about to die because it was just not giving up and the snow was getting heavier and heavier. And I knew, like, even with creating that air pocket, even with doing all the right things, I'm really just buying myself time, but this thing just didn't seem to be stopping. So that was one. The second one was climbing on Everest in 2016. There were so I remember we left at 2 o'clock in the morning for our summit push. We were leaving base camp, going up through the Khumbu Icefall, and there was probably a space of like 30 minutes where three big avalanches went off, and we're climbing in pitch black at 2 o'clock in the morning. So we can hear them, but we can't see them. And so we don't know whether we're in their pathway or not. And going up through that ice fall, you're just kind of accepting that you might be, because there's no other way to get onto the mountain without going through that section. So yeah, there was sort of like a 30-minute period where we were really we still had like 5 hours of climbing through that dangerous section. And it seemed like something could happen. So that's when I had to have a really honest conversation with myself about, how badly do you want to be there? We had a few climbers pull out that morning who just didn't want to take those risks. So yeah, that was the second point. The third was on that same expedition a few days later. So we were at Camp 4, the final camp on Everest, and that's really where the death zone starts. And so your body's slowly deteriorating. It's called the death zone whenever you're 8,000 meters and above. And so on summit day on Everest, you're climbing in that, and you've really got sort of 12 hours to make it up to the summit. And then you need to turn around and get back down, or your body will shut down and you'll run out of oxygen. And so that's always in your mind. You know, it's exciting. There's that adrenaline of its summit day. It all comes down to this day. But there's also that thought in the back of your mind of like, if anything goes wrong up here, even small things, they can be catastrophic. So that was certainly a moment for me when I remember leaving Camp 4, and we left at 8 o'clock at night, and you can just see this massive steepness of the mountain, and you just sort of have this sort of like, anything can happen today. And so, you know, it's not being sort of reckless, but just an understanding that you don't fully control it. And so kind of accepting that something could happen. That was the third. And definitely the fourth moment was on my second summit of Everest. So I'd summited the north side. We'd had a really long night of climbing and just being battered by winds for 12 hours in like -40. And we'd summited that morning from the north side of the mountain. And I remember being about 50 meters down on the way down for the descent. And I was still quite cognitively aware, but I just felt every ounce of energy in my body drain. Like it was complete survival mode. And you're near the top of the world. You still got a long way down to go. And I just had nothing left in the tank. And I just remember thinking, I don't know how I'm going to get down. And so, you know, you can almost start to panic. And for me, it was just about being aware and going, okay, breathe, and you have to get back down. So just start moving. But yeah, that was definitely, those are the 4 times where I've thought I've come closest to dying in the mountains.
Yeah, right. So what's been your favorite part about adventure?
I think the favorite part about adventure to me is kind of the rawness of it. It's very real. It doesn't, you know, discriminate. It gives everyone a challenge. I think that's what I've always enjoyed about it. For me, I just like learning, the lessons that I do from an expedition. I've always said, you know, I feel like I've grown more in 2 months on a high altitude mountain than I could in years, any other environment, just because of how intense it is. But I find that you learn so much from that. Even your most challenging days, the days where you think, I don't know how I'm going to get through the next hour. And yet somehow you get through the next 8 hours of climbing, and you've just got a whole new appreciation for what you're actually capable of. And so I think that's probably, what's always interested me the most and what I enjoy the most about it.
Yeah, nice. Do you ever think about the sacrifices you've sort of had to make to get to the position you're in, or was it never really a sacrifice for you because you've always just done what you loved?
I think it's a bit of both, interestingly. The sacrifices are not something I really thought about until after. I'd say it's only in the last couple of years since sort of stepping out of that, I guess, Everest bubble, where that was the whole world, that you start to realize how much you did sacrifice in order to get there. And I would say that I would do it all over again for that experience. I don't regret it as such, but I'm more aware now of like, there was a lot of stuff that you've got to trade in so that you can have this one. And so I think at the time when I was training for it, it was kind of the opposite. I was definitely struggling to get into anything else. I remember being sort of like 14, and around the time I set the goal of training for Everest, I just, I was doing okay, but I wasn't happy in school, and I couldn't really see a future that I was going to be particularly happy with. And so that's kind of when I took it into my own hands and went, all right, what do I actually want to be doing? What would be most fulfilling to me? And so, I'd say it's a mix of both. Like when I was training for Everest, and there's days that get tough, but I loved it and it was very fulfilling no matter how challenging it was. And it didn't feel like a sacrifice at the time. It felt like I'd traded in a lot of the stuff that just didn't feel like it was for me. And now I get to do something that is for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what does the sort of like the training for Everest look like in terms of gym training and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so it is a lot of almost pretty normal training from the outside looking in. You are on a training program, you are working toward a specific goal. So I think that's the main thing is, you're doing it with that intention in mind of everything that I do has to transfer across to climbing the mountain. I need to be able to use this when I'm on Everest. And so it's definitely, you've got to have a good balance of cardio, endurance, and strength. So I've worked with, strength and conditioning coaches and all of that sort of thing. So the day-to-day, week-to-week, I would typically train daily. And that was, yeah, I do pretty long pack walks on the weekends. So sometimes out for anywhere from sort of 4 to 6 to 8 hours with a heavy pack on, getting onto some hills, really building up that endurance so that you can go all day. But also it's running, it's gym sessions, but all stuff that again really needs to transfer across to the mountains. So it's all really functional. Sort of weightlifting, you need to have really strong legs, core, back, particularly when carrying a pack. So we work on all those things in the gym. But yeah, the most sport specific training is always those pack walks that we do on the hills. It gets your body ready for that. But yeah, I would do that pretty consistently. And then every so often we'd put that to the test where you go and do a training camp, where you then sort of adding in the mental elements to your physical fitness as well. And that was really, that sort of 3 to 5 year process. I'd train daily and build up that physical fitness. And then we'd sort of test it periodically to make sure that you're actually able to sort of use it under pressure.
Yeah, nice. And who would you say has had the biggest influence on your life to date?
There's two people that I would say equally come to mind. One of those is my dad. I just think the level of belief that he had in me, and allowing me those opportunities to get to not only prove to others, but prove to myself how capable I actually was. I think that really set the tone for me going forward. I'd say he's been my biggest supporter throughout everything that I've done. And one thing he always said to me is, I'm not going to stop you, but I'm not going to clear the way for you. I think particularly when I was training for Kokoda, he taught me a lot of really great lessons firsthand. And just gave me a lot of great tools that I could then use going forward. Understanding how to set that goal, how to be consistent toward it, how to actually achieve it. So I learned a lot from him, particularly in my early years, that I definitely use when, climbing Everest. But the second would be a mentor of mine, a guy named Keith Fennell. So he was ex-SAS. So he was the youngest Australian to pass SAS selection at 21. But also just for me, he was like the mentor that I needed at the time. I remember I went and did a training camp with him when I was probably 17 and I was about to have my first attempt on Everest. And yeah, we did the physical stuff, but really what I learned from him was a lot of the more mental stuff as well. We ran through a lot of strategies and concepts that were going to help me perform in an environment that is life and death, that does have a lot of unknown. But also he's just a really genuine person. So I found that he's someone that I could periodically sort of contact and check in with. And you just always know he's real down to earth, even though he's a high performer. And so that really helped me as well to kind of have that base to go back to, particularly when I was training for Everest and going through those few attempts before finally succeeding at it.
Yeah, that's great. Sounds like you got a pretty good support system there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely was very fortunate with the people that I got to surround myself with. And they were, definitely a huge part of sort of taking myself to that next level when training for Everest.
Yeah, nice. And do you have any sort of like daily habits that help you to be a high performer?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. Definitely my training. I find that, when I'm physically strong, I feel mentally strong as well. But there's a few other things that I do as well. And again, it just kind of depends on sort of what stage I'm at in life, whether I'm training for a big goal or kind of have a few things going on. But there's a few things that I always do, definitely my training. But I listen to different podcasts. I read a lot, always kind of looking for new information, but then I try and make sure that I'm acting on it as well. So one of my favorite books is High Performance Habits by Brendan Burchard. I love some of the concepts in that. And it's funny because when I read that, it was like, oh, this is everything that we did for Everest. Like this guy has it ironed out, but he's sort of nailed the theory behind it. So that's why I love that one so much. But yeah, definitely on a daily basis, I am training. Journaling as well is really helpful, I think, just to understand where you're at. But yeah, it just depends on what the goal is. I always sort of set the goal and then work back and work out what I need to do.
Yeah, I've started reading that book at the moment as well, and that's been like a real eye opener. It's been pretty good so far.
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot of great concepts in there, particularly with the goal setting, but also, he just talks about sort of some issues that also high performers go through that you don't always think about. Everyone sort of talks about getting to success, which is great. But I find it interesting that he talks about sort of the challenges you go through once you also do get to a certain level. The fact that even high performers, they burn out or they, have their own doubts and struggles, but you don't always know how to manage or handle that when you've always kind of been the person that does handle it. I find it's, yeah, he's really dig deep into what it takes to be a high performer. So yeah, definitely love that book.
Yeah, 100%. So what does the next chapter of your life look like?
So I am working that out as I go. I've not been too strict on myself because for a few years I was so tunnel vision. So I'm allowing myself at the moment to not be as strict on that, although I still physically train because I know in the not too distant future I will have another major climb on, maybe in a year or 2 years or something like that. So that's coming up. But yeah, it's more been exploring the opportunities outside of it that have come off the back of it. So for me, that's just different media opportunities. Yeah, some business partnerships that I've gotten to work with that, you know, will sort of come out over the next year or so that are pretty exciting as well. But for me at the moment, my focus is really going to university. So I'm doing a bit of study at the moment that is prepping me to then go and do a psychology degree. So that'll be my focus over the next few years. And yeah, again, still physically training so that when it's time to go for that next climb, I'll be ready to go.
Yeah, nice. Okay. And before I ask my last two questions, where can people find all of your content?
Yeah, so the best place is really my Instagram, probably, which is literally just Alyssa Azar, so ALYSSA AZAR. Pretty easy to find, but Facebook page as well. Again, just Alyssa Azar. It's just an athletes page. But there's also a website with contact if anyone wants to get in touch.
Nice. I'll put those in the show notes for everyone as well.
Sure, thank
So
you.
getting into the last questions now, this one's a little bit of a sort of like a hypothetical situation. So I want you to imagine you're speaking to the whole world at one time. So every single person on the planet is listening to you speak, and you could only give them three pieces of advice or three truths. What would you tell them?
Mhm. That's a really good question. I think first of all, I'd say learning to listen to your own voice is really important. That's something that's been a consistent lesson for me. I think often, yeah, that sort of gets squashed down under everything else. I think learning to believe in yourself and see yourself as an authority in your life as well, I think is really important. I think particularly when we're young, we're sort of taught that everyone else is, whereas I was taught certainly by my parents that you are an authority in your life. You get to have a say about, you know, where this goes, and you do get to control a lot of it. It's just being accountable for that, I think, is the first one. Um, that would be my main one, but I definitely think the second is I would say to people, you are far more capable than you think you are. And that's something that, like, I get to experience that firsthand. And it's almost something you wish you could hand to people, is that sort of experience. Because, like I said, you come off an expedition after 2 months and it's like who you thought you were and what you thought you could do. And it's just like, times 10, it's taken to a whole nother level. So yeah, I'm really grateful for that, and it's certainly something I wish I could hand other people. Yeah.
I love that answer. Okay, so lastly, I would just like to ask you, what is your definition of being state of the art, and why is that important?
My definition of being state of the art is bringing excellence to whatever it is that you want to do. For me, whatever you want to call it, excellence, mastery, greatness, that's certainly always been one of my values, something I've always admired in other people, whatever field that it is. Like whenever you see someone that's just next level, I've always had so much respect for that. Yeah, so I've always tried to be state of the art as a climber, I guess. Um, yeah, for me, it's just about consistently showing up and giving your best every time you do whatever it is that you do.
Awesome. Well, Alyssa, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
That's right. Thank you for having me.